Okay, thank you for attending this session about biology. We're going to be going over all of the 3 sections in Chapter 5 about populations in the textbook. If you're attending live, you're going to see polls pop up on the screen. Please participate in all of those. No one can see your individual answers, just the group's results, so if you don't know it, it's okay. And all the questions here are just for practice. They're not graded. If you're watching the video of this later, just kind of follow along with the polls at home. You don't have to click on anything. You don't have to submit them in any way. Just pay attention to them because they're helpful reviews and helpful to see if you need to go back and watch the video again or if you missed something. And if you're here live, you can ask questions at any time. If you're on a computer, you have a little speech bubble icon, and if you're on a phone or a tablet, you should have a question mark icon. You click on that, and then you'll be able to type in questions. So you can ask me to repeat anything or go back, explain something more. You can ask other questions about this lesson. You're not interrupting if you send any questions, just please ask, because that's what we're here for. So I'm going to go through a presentation of all 3 sections here. The first section in this chapter goes over how we describe populations and population growth. And so we measure populations by not just their size, so the number of individuals there are, but also by their geographic range, their density, their age structure, and their growth rate. Geographic range would be how they live and how much space the whole population uses. Density, age structure, and growth rate, we're going to go over more in depth as we go through the presentation. So population growth is based on the number of individuals added to the population by birth or immigration and removed from the population, by death or emigration, which is individuals leaving the area. And usually the birth and death rates have much more of an effect than immigration and emigration. Basically, when the birth rate is higher than the death rate, the population grows. There are also some cases where it grows because the immigration rate, the individuals moving in, is higher than the emigration rate, which is the individuals moving out. But again, usually the birth and death rates matter more. The size of a population is limited by the amount of resources available. Each habitat has a carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals that could live there for a long time. If the population gets higher than the carrying capacity, so in this graph it started out around the carrying capacity and then got higher, there won't be enough resources to keep them all alive. And often this resource is food, and some of the individuals will starve to death or emigrate until the population gets back to the carrying capacity and it hovers around there, kind of stabilizes around the carrying capacity. Always just a little higher or a little lower, but basically hovers around that line. So when the population grows, there are different types of population growth. In situations where resources are not limited at all, because there's extra resources, there's just more resources than the individuals can use up. When that happens and the organisms can reproduce rapidly, exponential growth can happen. In exponential growth, each generation multiplies in size. You can tell exponential population growth because if you graph it, the graph makes a J shape like this. So in this example, it's kind of a loose J, but it's that idea. It's an upward curve like this. And again, exponential growth only happens when there are extra resources, more resources than the individuals can use up. And this usually happens when a population appears in a new place. When bacteria encounters a large source of food, or humans bring new species into the environment, exponential growth can happen. and exponential growth results in a problem. The population quickly reaches the carrying capacity and runs out of resources. It exceeds the carrying capacity and they can't even continue to survive. Sometimes because there's so many individuals reproducing, the resources get completely depleted and most of the population dies off. Most growing populations exhibit a different style of growth that's called logistic growth. So in logistic growth, the population starts off in a situation with extra resources, so it grows exponentially for a short time. However, instead of continuing out of control, the growth slows down as the population size nears the carrying capacity. So you can see that in this graph. Um, It started out with a low population, it grows, and in this section it grows pretty rapidly, but as it's nearing the carrying capacity, the growth slows down. So it's still increasing, it's still going towards the carrying capacity, but not nearly as fast as it was in this section. So, okay. The growth slows down as it reaches the carrying capacity, and the population growth then kind of stops. It may swing up and down a little bit as it stabilizes, but it remains right around the carrying capacity. And when logistic growth is graphed, it makes kind of a stretched out S shape. Okay, so you've got that curve like an S, and that's how you could tell the difference between that and exponential growth. So that brings us to the end of this section. So we've got a couple review questions. Do we move on? So which of the following is not true about exponential growth? So I'm going to put another poll up on your screen. Thank you for those of you that answered the original first poll we had, and I would like you to answer this one as well. So which of the following is not true about population growth? I'm sorry, about exponential population growth. It makes a J shape when graphed. The growth of the population happens very rapidly. It happens when there are extra resources, or it always slows down before reaching the carrying capacity. So three of those are true. Select the one that is not true. And I'm going to just stop talking and give you about 10-15 seconds to think about it and vote. Okay, so it looks like several of you voted. Good job. Um, Close the poll. So I'm glad to see that nobody selected these first two because they're definitely not it. So it makes a J shape when graphed. That is true. It does make a J shape when graphed. It happens very rapidly. That's true. Now, some people did select this third one. It happens when there are extra resources. That's also true. So the only way that exponential growth can happen is if there's so many resources that the population isn't running out. Like, again, if bacteria encounters a new source of food, um, or like you have fruit in your fridge and mold starts growing on it. Well, it starts as just one little spot and it's got this entire like giant orange to grow on. So there's lots of food. It's not going to be what inhibits the growth because there's so much food that until it covers the whole thing is not running out of food. The example in your book is an invasive plant called hydrilla that's not supposed to live in the United States, but it got brought over here, and now it just grows in our water and spreads really far, and it causes a lot of problems. And that's because there's all these extra resources. It's not supposed to be here, it wasn't here before, and so now when it comes to a new location, it's just got all of the food and nutrients that it needs. So that's when it happens. So our correct answer then, the only one that's not true, is that it always slows down before reaching the carrying capacity. So with exponential growth, sometimes you have it way overshoot the carrying capacity, and then there's that crash afterwards where, okay, it's destroyed all of the resources now, and now the population gets destroyed because none of them can live. Okay, so that's all about exponential growth. Our next review question is about logistic growth. So let me share that poll. So again, answer this poll on your screen. Which of the following is not true about logistic growth? It makes a U shape when graphed. The growth of the population happens rapidly for a while. Or the growth slows down before the carrying capacity is reached. So again, I'll give you about 20 seconds to think about that. Choose which one is not true about logistic growth. Okay, so I think I need to go back to this one. So this is why we do these polls, so that I can see that we need to review this again because not a lot of people got this one right. And that's okay, because that's why we have these lessons, so we can see what we need to learn before the test. All right, so logistic growth is this kind of growth that you're seeing the graph of on the screen, where, there we go. So it starts growing, and during this phase, it's very rapid, but then it slows down. So when it starts to reach the carrying capacity, it slows down. So this line is very steep at the beginning, and then it is much less steep later. And we do refer to this graph as being S-shaped. Okay, so it's kind of a stretched out S, just like, I'll go back, your exponential growth is kind of a stretched out J. Oops, there we go. All right, so it makes kind of a J shape. It's obviously, stretched out. It's not a very clear J, but it's just that one sweeping upward curve. Whereas with your logistic growth, you've got where it starts to curve up and then it tapers off. So it makes that S curve. So it does grow rapidly for a little bit. It does slow down before reaching the carrying capacity, and it does make an S shape. So let's look at our answers. Our choices where it makes a U shape when graphed. Well, that's the one that's not true. It makes an S shape. The next one is true. The growth does happen rapidly for a while, and then once it reaches that carrying capacity, it slows down. And then this one is also true. The growth slows down before reaching carrying capacity. And that's pretty much what defines logistic growth. It doesn't go crazy out of control. It slows down in time to not cause a problem. It hits the carrying capacity and it's stopped growing by that point. Okay, so that might be something to review in your book a little more since most people actually didn't get that one right. But again, that's okay. That's why we have these lessons. That's how we learn what we need to study. So in the previous section, we mentioned limits on resources that limit population size. And in this chapter, or this section, we're going to explore these limits. A limiting factor is any factor that controls the size of the population. And there's kind of different kinds of these. These could be resources that limit the individuals in the population that these could be resources that the individuals in the population depend on to live, such as food and water and space. So there's only so much of that to go around, so it's going to limit how many of them can be living in that area. And then limiting factors can also be factors that increase the death rate, things like predators and natural disasters or bad weather. that are going to limit how big the population can get or cut the population down. Okay, so let's look at a little more about these. Before we can really categorize them, we need to review population density. So this is actually a term from section 1 in this chapter. Population density is the number of individuals living in a certain amount of space. So a high density has a lot of individuals per unit of area, and a low density has less individuals in that same amount of area. Okay, so that's illustrated on the screen on the left. Within the same amount of space, there's obviously way more in the one on the left than there is on the one on the right. So the left is high density, the right is low density. And that's going to matter when we're talking about limiting factors. So we divide limiting factors into two types. Density-dependent limiting factors depend on the number of individuals in the area. They're going to be more effective on those high-density areas. These include the relationships between predators and prey, relationships between herbivores and plants. It's kind of the same thing. How many herbivores are there to eat the plants? It's going to control the population of the plants. But also the amount of food that's available for the herbivores will control the population of the herbivores. So it goes both ways. Same thing with predators and prey. It goes both ways. It controls both of them. Between parasites and their hosts, very similar. Between diseases and their hosts, very similar. And we've also got this one that's a little different, relationship between individuals of the same species, which is mainly competition for resources or possibly competition for mates. All right, so with that last one, between individuals of the same species, competition is an important limiting factor. Things like food and water and space may be required by all individuals, so not having enough of these to go around creates competition, and that limits the maximum size of the population. Okay, the other category is density independent factors, ones where the population density does not matter. It's independent. Um, Density independent factors, there's not a lot of. It's pretty much large scale natural disasters and bad weather. So you get a storm, a flood, a hurricane, a volcano, something that's going to kill off a lot of the population indiscriminately. Um, I think a very clear example is a flood. If you have, um, let's say, ants, where if the whole area floods, they're all going to die. It doesn't matter how high or low the population is, it's just going to kill all of them in that area. So it's not a matter of resources and density, it's just this happened and now they're all gone. So those are density independent. Okay, and this is actually a shorter section, so we've got a review already. Which of these is a density dependent limiting factor? And I'll post the poll. There we go. Only one of these choices is density dependent. The others are not. So choose the one that is a density dependent limiting factor from floods, predators, lava flow from volcanoes, or exponential growth. And again, I'll be quiet for about 20 seconds, give you the chance to answer. Okay, so just gonna pop back to the previous slide here because again we had kind of a mixed bag. Density dependent, again, are things that matter how many individuals of the population live there. It's going to determine um, what limits the size of the population. So things like relationships between different species, the amount of food that's available, so predators or herbivores, the amount of food, diseases, which spread differently based on how dense the population is, competition between them. Those are all density dependent. It's going to affect, if I can go back another slide, those things will affect a high density population differently than a low density population. Okay, density independent is things that just wipe out a whole bunch of them. Things like large scale natural disasters and bad weather, where it's just going to wipe away a whole area, not concerned with what the density is, how many of them are there. Okay, so back to this, floods is density independent. Okay, so it doesn't matter if there's a lot of the creatures living there or a few of them. If the whole area is flooded with water, it's going to wipe them all out equally. Predators is a density-dependent limiting factor. The number of predators is going to affect the number of prey animals that can exist. If there's a higher population, it's going to affect the number of predators there are, which is going to in turn affect the population. It just kind of goes back and forth. Lava flow is density independent. It's pretty much just like floods. Anything that's in its path is going to get wiped out. Doesn't matter if there's a lot of them or a little of them. And exponential growth is just something I threw in there as a confusing, so I'm glad that no one picked that. That's not a limiting factor at all. Okay, so predators are density dependent and the other two are density independent. And our last section is about population growth of the worldwide human population. So the population of humans went into exponential population growth in the 1800s. So for all of human history, there is not a lot of humans. You can't even tell that there's a line here. There is a little bit of gray, but it's so small that you can't really see it. And then it got bigger. So around the time that agriculture began to happen, the growth of the human population increased. Well, not that agriculture began to happen, but that like big cities began to form around it. And then, it increased steadily. And then all of a sudden, it went nuts. So right around in the middle of the 1800s, basically around the Industrial Revolution, the human population just took a huge upswing and hasn't really stopped. It's still growing exponentially. So why did this happen? Mainly because medicine, healthcare, nutrition, and sanitation have decreased the death rate, while the birth rate remains high. So for the rest of human population, for every um, 10 children that were born, maybe 3 or 4 of them survived to adulthood. And now, um, once better medication and sanitation became prevalent, most children are surviving to adulthood. Oops, do that every time. Okay, so the human population has gone crazy. We're now above 7 billion people, and it's expected to keep increasing. So when we talk about human population, one thing that we look at is the demographic transition. And demographic transition is a 3-stage concept where the population's birth rate and death rates both eventually decrease. So initially, they're both high and the population remains stable. So in stage 1, you can see the birth rate and death rate are right next to each other. And they're just not really changing. That's stage 1. Nothing has really happened yet. They're both pretty high. So a lot of people are born and a lot of people die, and it evens out. Then in stage 2, the death rate drops. And again, this is from improved healthcare, improved sanitation, improved medicines. The birth rate remains exactly the same as it was, but then the death rate drops down. This is going to lead to a lot of population growth, a lot of people being born and less people dying. And this is the phase where human population has been for a while, where the population grows exponentially because the birth rate is much bigger than the death rate. And then in the third stage, the birth rate actually decreases and eventually stabilizes with a low birth rate and a low death rate. And that's where a lot of countries are getting to now, um, where the birth rate is falling to be actually about the same as the death rate. So it's still higher in most countries. The population is still growing, but we're working towards stage 3. So people in general are having less children than they did 200 years ago, because less people are dying. So those are the 3 stages of demographic transition. And again, worldwide in the population, not all countries are in the same stage. And when we talk about human population, or any population, but when we talk about these aspects of population, we talk about age structure. So population changes are affected by age structure. This is the number of individuals that are at different ages in a population. For example, this graph shows the age structure of Angola. There are very few old people and very many children. So you can see that looking at the graph. Each bar is an age range, 0 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, 15 to 19. So you could say that these areas, from there down, they're very high. Then you have middle-aged people, and then you have elderly people. And these bars are very small. Okay, so there's very few elderly people compared to middle-aged people and compared to children. And what this means for this particular group, okay, this age structure of the country of Angola, um, the population, if it stays this way, the population will grow very quickly because as the years go by, these large bars of young people are going to move up as they get older. Okay, so in 20 years, this huge group will be up here. And they'll be having children that'll fill out the bottom of the group. And then as these elderly people get older and die, then the middle-aged one will fill in. So it always just kind of moves upward as time goes by. So again, in this population, these large groups of young people will eventually be filling in the top of the graph, making it bigger, and then they will be having their own children that fill in the bottom of the graph. Then this graph of Spain shows a different age structure. Here, the biggest groups are 20 to 40-year-olds, but there are not many children compared to the 20 to 40-year-olds. So this population will not grow the way the last one did, because as the years go by, there are not an excess of children to take the space of the older people. So as everything moves upward in this graph, you're going to get a smaller group that comes here in this age of reproducing, so they're going to have less children. So this population will actually just sort of stay the same or get a bit smaller as opposed to the last population that would grow quickly. And worldwide population growth in most countries has slowed down. We're approaching the third stage of demographic transition. But it is still very high in India and China and several other countries. These countries are still in stage 2 of demographic transition. It's expected that the population of the whole world will continue growing, but the growth will slow down over the next 50 years. This graph from your book shows a recent age structure in the bright green. Um, and the age structure expected in the year 2050 in dark teal. So you might notice that the bright green shows more young people than old people or middle-aged people. So the bright green part of the graph is kind of shaped like this. So you get more young people that are going to go higher, as we grow up, those bars are going to move up. They're going to fill out the middle of the graph and make the whole thing bigger. So this indicates that the population will grow. But then when you look at the teal parts of it, again, this is what's projected, what's expected in the year 2050. There's a lot more even distribution among the age levels. So just kind of outlining it, there's not a whole lot of change until you get to really old. So the teal shows a more even distribution among age levels, and that indicates that not much more growth will happen. So once we get to that point, there's not extra young people to replace the old people. It's just going to be about the same amount replacing the old people. So again, they expect the population will continue growing a lot until that point, and then population growth will slow down a bit. So one last poll review question for you to answer. What can you tell about the population from this age structure diagram? Actually, I won't bring the poll up till we read it so that you can look at the picture. So based on this diagram, can you tell that there are many more males than females? There are many more children than middle-aged people? There are less elderly people than middle-aged people? Or there are more elderly people than middle-aged people? Okay, so keep in mind the shape of that graph. And I'm going to launch this last poll for you to answer. And I will just give you about 20 seconds to answer it. All right, awesome. Thanks to you that answered. Everyone that did answer got the correct answer. So from this age structure diagram, um, there are not actually many more males than females. It's about the same. So these are always kind of split in half, showing the males on one side and the females on the other side. So they're, the width of the bars for the females is about the same as the width of the bars for the males. There's actually slightly more females. So that's not the right answer because they're about the same. There are many more children than middle-aged people. Whoa, that line's not supposed to be there. There's actually slightly less. So our children's bars are over here and over here. And middle-aged would be, right around here. So there's actually more middle-aged people and children in this group. And then our last two options, there are less elderly people or more elderly people. Well, if you look at the elderly people, we've got much smaller bars. Okay, so there's less of them than the middle-aged people. So that makes our correct answer that one. There are less elderly people than middle-aged people in this group. And one last question. This one is not a poll because there's no way to put this type of question as a poll, so just kind of follow along, think about it. The stages of demographic transition. So you have stage 1, 2, and 3. So we're just going to match them. Which one is stage 1? Which one is stage 2? Which one is stage 3? So I'm going to just mute myself for a few seconds, give you time to think about it, and then I'll go over what the correct answers are. Okay, so the stages of demographic transition. Now remember, the whole part of demographic transition, the whole point is we start out with high birth rates and high death rates, and then transition and end up with low birth rates and low death rates. So we can kind of think of the stages as far as human history goes. So in stage one, you have high birth rates and high death rates. So think of like people in the Middle Ages. A lot of people died as babies, so families had lots of babies because they wanted to have hope of some children surviving to be adults. Then medicine became a lot better. People understood a lot more about healthcare, and so it lowered the death rates. So stage two, you still have the same high birth rates because people are used to like, let's just have lots of children. But the death rate decreased. So you have lots of babies, none of them are dying, the population grows. Then stage three is the kind of final stage where the death rate stays low and the birth rate declines also. So people finally um, realize they don't need to be having so many kids because most of them will survive. So we have a lower birth rates as people have less children, and there's still lower death rates. Okay, so those are the three phases of demographic transition. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. If you're watching the recording, here are different ways that you can contact your instructors.